Corporations article was on the community of North Lawndale. And in the 60s, it was a predominantly Jewish neighborhood with a few middle-class black families living in there. And over time, blacks who were looking to fulfill the American dream decided to go to North Lawndale and looked at it as a haven, as a place where they could rebuild themselves, where coming from the South, they can sit here, build, have a family, live out the American dream of owning a house, having a family with the next job. But like I said, if history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And the case was the same here as it was in many places across America. In Chicago, in the 60s, if you were black, you couldn't get a mortgage or a loan. Fast forward to 2014, it's still the same to an extent. However, things have gotten a little better. Recently, Wells Fargo and Goldman Sachs came under scrutiny for this practice in our banking system, in which they were both accused of discriminately charging black and Latino families a higher interest rate and steering them towards subprime mortgage loans, which was one of the catalysts for the financial crash or crisis in 2008. As a result, the disproportionate rate of foreclosures, which the Turner family had their estate foreclosed on, is highest among black and Latino families. And the economic inequalities that have been perpetuated over the course of our history still persist to this day. Tracing back to the 60s, you see the same effect. You see the face of the institution has changed. Instead of banks, there were middlemen. These middlemen, they would negotiate contracts on these new houses that were being formed in Chicago. And the contracts were considered, in today's terms, to be predatory agreements. See, to explain, one of these middlemen would come in to a neighborhood, go up to a white family and say, hey, black people are moving in. White people see that and, hey, the property of my house is going down because as it was at the time, you didn't want to be in a neighborhood where black people lived. And it was seen, and at the time it was very segregated. Even to this day, Chicago is still a very segregated city. These middlemen would take these white families' houses and sell them for below the market price. So let's say you had a house that was assessed at $20,000. You sold the house for 10. They go to a black family looking to move in, sell it to them for 2 to 3 times the value of that. And then they would not only would they not give them the deed to the house, but then they would give them all of the disadvantages of being a renter. And so instead, you were in a house, but you were renting it. Not only did you not acquire any equity on the house, but if you missed a payment, at any time, these contract sellers could take the house from you and sell it to another family and evict you, and you would have no protection of the law. You see, one might ask, how did things even get this way? Where did this come from? How were these men able to execute a scam numerous times on so many black families, and nobody came to justice for it? They had the protection of the law, the same law that blacks came from the South and migrated up to find the protection in, which is why I said that this form of racism was just as evil and vindictive, where it didn't physically oppress you, it economically emasculated you, which is just as bad. The fact is that the government was a catalyst behind the situations in Chicago as it was in Mount Vernon. It was the government that proved to be the biggest force behind not only the legal, economic, it was the biggest force behind the legal, economic, and social constraints that the families in Chicago, as well as the Turner family, had to deal with. In 1934, Congress created the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA. The FHA worked to insure mortgages and also would give out loans, which would help in lowering interest rates. To a homeowner, lower interest rates and insured mortgages sounds like a great idea. However, it was because of the FHA, they had a mechanic in which proved very severe to black families. You see, they would take maps of cities, so let's take Mount Vernon for example. In areas where there were white families or high stability in which you had a good job, you had a good family, and things were stable, they would rate these areas in green, and they qualified for these FHA mortgages and loans. In areas where, as I read, one real estate advisor put it, areas in which Negroes and foreigners were not allowed. Those were where these loans went to. They were green. In areas where black families lived, or there was a sense of poverty, they were rated red, and they got a red mark. From here is where the term that you might have heard before, redlining, comes from. These banks would redline areas in which minorities lived in, and you would be denied a loan, you would be denied a mortgage. During the 60s, it was a time of great growth, and not having access to these loans having access to these mortgages, it forced black people to be forced into these communities where they were overpopulated, underfunded, police brutality was its highest. And what you see is a perpetuation of a cycle that stems back now into the 60s, but precedes the 60s, and in the case for the Turner family, goes back to the 1800s. So how does all this relate to the Turner family? It not only documents their struggle that they had to face before the 60s, in the 1890s, when the land was,
Well,
when was it foreclosed on? Or
officially, well, it began about 1910. She fought them so hard, they couldn't get it done until 1938, 39.
so,
But their position was that they never owned it, right?
They knew they owned it.
But when they called it a squatter, the implication was
They
they're gonna take it.
foreclosed on it for non-payment of tax.
so I just want to I wanted to ask that question because, you know, the fact that a black family in the late 1800s was not only able to own a house, but also to own the land, or in this case, it was given to them in the 1800s was something that was seen as a rare occurrence. I mean, not only even in today's economy, it's very hard to find a black family or black families who own land and own the house, own the land. And you know, when I started reading the research that Mr. Goodside gave to me that you have published, I looked into it. I was like, you know, this is something that requires further research that more people need to understand about, because people don't really know how great of an accomplishment this is. We too negatively look at all the bad that is going on, and yet when we have things like this, we don't put the spotlight on it. And I thought that when I was reading that, I got more and more passionate about this because I realized how this story needs to be told. You know, the land it was built on, it stands out as an accomplishment to further research, and I realized that the accomplishment of black people in this country always seems to come under threat from outside forces. And in this case, dark forces were circling over the Turner estate, in which they wanted to see a Negro family turn into nothing more than a Negro squatter. And you just gotta ask yourself, how did a family who, as you've heard, has such a rich history in this city or in this area, go from being a respectable black family to nothing more than a Negro squatter? Reading into more of the research that Dr. Spool provided on the Turner estate, you start to see how these dark forces mobilized. In the early 1900s, the East Chester Creek was seen as a project that would not only deepen the creek, but also deepen the pockets of oil companies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's the fact that at the same time that FHA was being created in 1934, federal legislation sponsored by the Roosevelt administration was also paving the way to complete the foreclosure on the Turner estate. Too often throughout the course of history have black people been herded into the view on unscrupulous predators, with people taking advantage of their struggle for profit and sport. You know, just like the decades-long fight that Sarah Nelson fought to keep her ancestral land from the falling hands of these black gold vultures. You know, in Chicago, members of the North Lawndale community banded together to form the Contract Buyers League. You know, with this league, they wanted to file suit against these contract sellers who had taken them for granted, taken their money to profit off of them. You know, it's one of the first creations of a black league to fight back against the racism that they were dealing with. And once again, it's not something I heard of. You don't read it in textbooks. You don't hear about this in history. I got it from an article that I read in 2013. Didn't know about that for 22 years. You would expect, as somebody who's an African American in this country, that you would hear about these things, but you don't. You don't hear these point of views. You don't hear this history. It's not told to people, but you hear the history, as I said, of Ann Hutchinson, John Stevens, John Quincy, all these other people, but you don't hear about your history. You know, and with the creation of the Contract Buyer League, they wanted to fight back against the unjust laws and practices that these contract sellers looked to. So they filed a lawsuit. They were looking for protection of the law. And then when they did that, they used the 13th Amendment, which states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as the punishment for a crime where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Which basically says is that we're not going to sit here and take this any longer. We're going to fight back, and you're not going to treat us unjustly. which is unheard of at this time, that a group of almost 500 members would come together to fight back against the law, the same law that was supposed to be put into place to protect them. They also used the 14th Amendment, specifically Section 1 of the amendment, which talks about the deprivation of property with due process, or once again, the law, in which their property, which they had bought through the contract, they put down money on it, was not only taken from them, but once again, they didn't receive any compensation, they didn't receive any, there was no trial, there was nobody there to just, hey, here's the land, now, like, this is our land, you can just go, and we just bring in another family, and the cycle continues. There was no process, there was no due process of the land being taken, there was no court battles. It was just, well, you don't have the money, so you can go now. They were fighting against that. No longer would members of this community sit back and watch it be destroyed by outside forces. They took this fight directly to the social norms that had been placed in the 60s and decided that they were going to fight against it. You know, gone were the days where blacks from the South looking for protection of the law. No, instead they were decided that they were going to be the law. They were going to make sure that this wouldn't happen to people. You know, in the case of the Turner family, there weren't any buyers' leagues. There wasn't a community that came together. You know, there was no protection. And this was in the North. The Turner estate was fighting a battle it could not prevail victorious in. As I believe you said, they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. However, it is often the fight of the few that indubitably motivates the actions of the many. It was the fight of the Contract Buyers League, as well as the Turner estate, which fought for years, that served to stand as a mark in history. No longer will the struggle of these people be lost to history. Instead, they serve as a stepping stone to a vista of new research in history, which is why we are here today. If it wasn't for the Contract Buyer League or the Turner estate, we wouldn't be gathered here today. We wouldn't be talking about this. This information wouldn't be brought to you. But instead, it's the fight that these people fought years ago. It's just why I'm here today talking to you about what they've done, and why Dr. School is here today talking about the research that he's done for over 30 years. You know, for my senior research thesis, I was given the great liberty to use Mount Vernon as a case study. My thesis proposed a question about the connection between government funding and incarceration rates in Black communities, and what the government does to help. I decided what better city to understand this dynamic than in Mount Vernon, my hometown. Reading about North Lawndale and the research that I did into Mount Vernon, I see many similarities. You know, Mount Vernon is a city in the richest county in the state of New York. However, we are one of the poorest. It is often seen that Black neighborhoods in Chicago earn 3 times less than their white counterparts. Researching my thesis, I found the correlation between income and incarceration rates. I saw that as income goes down, incarceration rates go up. I realized that this was not only the case in Chicago, but it was also the case in Mount Vernon. In Chicago, the highest incarceration rate of a Black neighborhood is 40 times as high as that of a white neighborhood with the highest rate. I also saw that the income gap between Black families and white households is the same in the 70s as it is today. I also saw that whereas only 4% of white people are born into poverty or poor neighborhoods, 62% of Black people are born into poverty and poor neighborhoods. And lastly, whereas whites who are born into affluent neighborhoods tend to remain there, Black people fall out of those neighborhoods and fall back down. So where if you see a Black family who is into a prominent neighborhood, 20 years from now, they'll be back right where they'll regress. And you see that all across this country, from California to New York to Chicago to Florida, you see this everywhere. The case for reparations in the United States is not something that's new. You know, one must go all the way back to 1782 to find one of the first cases of reparations in this country. I know you were talking about the Quakers earlier, and when I was doing some research, I found that the Quakers would often grant their former slaves with plots of land. And in one such instance, Robert Pleasant, he gave his 80-some-odd slaves 350 acres of land and built a school on it to provide education for them. You know, throughout this time, the idea of reparations wasn't seen as something that was outrageous. It wasn't seen as this crazy idea that if you listen to people today, it seems ludicrous. Upon their death, there are a lot of cases in which slave masters would often give freedom to all their slaves and grant them plots of land so that they could use it once they had become free. As time passed, though, the idea of reparations became more outrageous for some reason. As one newspaper in the 1890s wrote, and this is something that, like, they have been taught to labor, they have been taught the Christian civilization, and to speak the noble English instead of some African gibberish. What people seem to forget is that once given freedom, blacks were not left on their own. Instead, they faced racism in the South through lynching, tar and feathering, bombing of churches, and in the North, legislatures, mayors, banks, and citizens all worked to herd black people into overcrowded, overcharged, undereducated ghettos, as we saw in North Lawndale and other parts such as Detroit. Businesses also joined in by discriminating against blacks, offering them the worst jobs with the lowest pay. Police also joined in, targeting and brutalizing these same people, and we still see that today in 2014. Stop and frisk. Now, in 2014, it's still sad to say that the black life, body, and wealth are still targets for the institutional racism that begets our conditions. Since the days of Lincoln, the target has been on the back of black people who feel that they escaped from the grips of slavery. For the next 250 years, the American law worked to try to reduce black people to a second class. It is documented through history and is often seen now in disproportionate ways that black people fill our prison system. One must ask why majority black school systems always seem to struggle when compared to their white counterparts. Why the only city in Westchester County in which the population is mostly black is also one of the worst school districts in the county. What forces at hand have led to the reputation that Mount Vernon has? You know, one must look not only at the outside forces, but also internally, and ask why Mount Vernon is the way it is today. You know, a lot of people like to blame what others have done, but one has to reflect on oneself and see what Mount Vernon needs to do in order to get past the reputation. And it starts at the top. The Turner family is just one of thousands of black families to see their land taken away. The destruction of the ancestral grounds of the family serve as a view into the for-profit destruction that has facilitated the rise of the American empire. The wealth of this country was built on the backs of slaves who picked cotton in the South, sorghum manufactured in the North, sent across the Atlantic to Great Britain. And not only did the triangle trade, as many people might have heard of, not only did it change the history of the United States into the military and economic juggernaut that it is today, but it also changed the history of a race of people forever. When the Allied nations won the Second World War, they helped rebuild West Germany so that history would not repeat itself, in which a person like Hitler would come to power again. You know, as part of that rebuilding effort, the Germans had to pay reparations to the Jewish population. And they had to pay these reparations to the same people that they gassed, enslaved, segregated, discriminated, killed. It wasn't seen as ludicrous. It wasn't seen as something that was outrageous. The Germans did it. And to this day, billions of dollars has been paid out to Jewish people. And they're still paid out to them to this day. When Native Americans were pushed off their land and killed by genocide, disease, and war, after a long fight of resistance, the United States gave them reservations. They gave them pieces of land. And casinos. Some might say, well, you know, they didn't have to do, but they did something. For black people in this country, we have received no monetary reparation, our 40 acres and a mule. We haven't received anything of compensation for building this country to what it is today. Instead, we get laws, affirmative action, Voting Rights Act. You know, these laws were put into place thanks to the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, but till this day, in 2013, these laws are now under attack. The Voting Rights Act in June 2013, Section 5 was just considered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. It's the same provision that was put there to stop the racism, to stop these new voter ID laws, which inhibit the right to vote for blacks, Latinos, younger people who are seen now as the growing population in this country. Affirmative action is now being challenged in the courts. These laws that were put in place now are under constant attack. it seems as this country is trying to revert back to the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, and years previously. You know, I tell you these atrocities and I tell you these stories to show that the struggle of Black people has been a very long struggle. The land in this country there's land in this country that has been taken away from Black families, and they have not been paid for it. The Turner family was able to avoid some of this violent retribution that we've seen, but like the previously named families, they still fell to the powers to be. You know, there's no compensation worthy enough to those who own that land. There's no amount of money at this moment that you can pay to these people, but I feel that there is recognition. You can recognize these people. And whereas some people are looking for a handout or looking for a quick way to make money off of land, you know, just realizing that history has shown us what has happened before to these people, and using history to see that it can happen to anybody in this room serves that you need to recognize these people so that your grandchildren and your great-grands, your children, or you yourself can recognize that, hey, this is what's happened. This is what they're not telling you. This is what's going on. So if our history has taught us anything, is that we need to understand the fight of these people who have been victimized. And we all need to come together at the end of the day to break this cycle of negativity, of misinformation, of being casted off the list of Eastchester's 350 years, where they don't even see 60,000 people worthy enough of our history being told. You know, we need to break the cycle and come together, because it's too easily to use the power of one to disenfranchise the voice of many. You know, it always seems that people in power who have a voice always come down harshly on those who lack a voice. The people who can't speak out for themselves are always seen as some of the people in this community who are targeted the most, because no one's coming to bat for them. There's no community. You know, if someone's beating on a homeless man in the corner, who's coming out there to help him if he knows nobody? That's where community comes in. That's what Mount Vernon is about. We are the city of homes. We are a city that believes. And if we can't believe in each other, then who else? Who's gonna believe in us? And that's the case that we see today. That's why our reputation is the way it is. Because we don't believe in ourselves anymore. I mean, you might believe, but does everyone else believe with you? And that's a very powerful idea, to have a community as a whole work together, so that forces like oil companies and politicians who have their hand in other people's pockets and all these unscrupulous people who always want to leech off of this community. This is how if you come together, nobody can take us down. And with that, I bring my speech to a close, and just, you know, it's a great opportunity to express this.
Young man who graduated, he played football for us, and rather than go to the homecoming, he came here with the intellect that he has. And when people talk about our school system, these two gentlemen are examples of how terrific our schools can be.
3, 4.
You could come up too. This is Daniel Doggett, he's the principal of this school.
That's right.
Give us a couple of words, and then I'll start a conversation.
Good morning, good afternoon, I should say. Sorry for my tardiness. I was at a workshop at Mount Vernon High School, but I made it my business to come here to hear this history of our peoples. It's very important that our youth hears the history and that we hear it, so we know exactly where we're going. Does anybody have any questions for me? Yes. First, I want to thank Mr. Goodzite and the board trustees and the superintendent for making this event happen. And I know it's on Saturdays. It's going to be a couple Saturdays that this is going to go on. I sent K-12 alerts out to you, so please look out for those information, and I will send literature home. And we will be discussing the Turner family in our curriculum in our school year.
I'm going to take questions in a minute, no comments, okay? But what I would like you to do is, at our next board meeting, which is November 5th, the next board community comment meeting, I would like to bring a resolution to the board to achieve what Dr. School has worked 30 years to achieve, and to rename the educational complex of Longfellow Middle School and Longfellow Elementary School for the Rebecca and Benjamin Turner. Do you have we need everybody to come and speak up, and you need to register by 3 o'clock. If we pass it as a board, because I don't want to predict the future, the board has to make a decision. I would like to come back here another day, because Principal Dog had promised me that, because I gave him a bunch of these books that Dr. School wrote, and it was like late in September, and he said if you don't pass the change, then he didn't see a reason why he had to go through all of this stuff. But I wanted to have an experience with the young people at the middle school and at the high school reading both books that Dr. School has written and come back here. So on the day we dedicate the buildings, I would like to have that conversation again with the two schools. Okay? Any questions for the gentleman? Ms.
Yes.
Booth?
We know that, good evening, afternoon, my life. We know in addition to Germany, Japan also received reparations.
Yes.
Okay. I would like to know from either one of you, and since we have the Voting Rights Act, affirmative action, all those were considered, paybacks to us, whatever. That doesn't work. What would you consider reparations for the 21st century for black folks who multiplied, mushroomed, etc. What would be an acceptable reparation to people who've had their lands stolen from them, their lives taken, ropes around the neck, etc., etc.? What price?
It's such an extensive history that I don't believe one solution can honestly address everything that's going on over the last 400 years.
Yes,
I was reading an article in which we got the representative, I forgot his name, but he wanted to create a committee. And it was just a committee, not any laws. And every time that the House comes together to, I guess you can say, open up its new semester of making laws, he brings this resolution to the floor, and every time it's voted down. And no, this is part of the civil rights movement. Yes, that's his name. I can't remember. Every time that they come to meet, he brings this resolution forward, and it's voted down. What I'm saying is that that's a great idea to have a committee that can sit there and talk about. We're not even in the 21st century. We're not even to the point where we can talk about reparations. And I like thinking of it right now, I don't even know where to start. You can create committees. You can, because the case of reparations in this country, as I said, is so deeply rooted. Is that where do you start?
Yeah.
It's just, do you start in the South? Do you start in the North? It's such a very difficult question to ask. But if you have a conversation about it and you can hear from different parts of the country, in the South, Georgia, Virginia, Florida, if you can hear how people living there are dealing with the struggle, and you can create, like I said, a committee that you have a regional committee, so where you'll have people in the South have a committee, people in the North have a committee, and you come together and you listen to people ask them, what do you need? How can we help? And just have that conversation flowing, then you can start to address the issues that are going on. Because like it's such an expansive, like where do you there's no real place to start with that conversation. And I'm really thinking about it. It's just like,
I see